When Amy and I moved into our new home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, we thought we'd finally found the perfect place to settle down. It was a small house with a fenced-in backyard, the kind of spot where you could imagine raising kids and hosting barbecues on weekends. Everything about it seemed ideal. The neighbors kept to themselves, which was just fine by us. After years of apartment living and noisy neighbors, we were excited about the peace and quiet. But from the very beginning, there was something odd about the house across the street. It wasn't anything glaringly obvious, just subtle things that didn't sit right. The blinds were always closed, the yard was unkempt, and no one ever seemed to come or go. At first, Amy and I joked about it being a hermit house, but soon, those jokes stopped feeling funny. It all began one evening in late August. I was out back grilling burgers while Amy set the table inside. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. As I flipped a burger, I glanced across the street and froze. There was a face in the second-story window of the house. It was pale, partially obscured by the curtains, and completely still. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but then the face shifted slightly, as if leaning forward. "Hey, Amy," I called, my voice trying to sound casual but failing. "What's up?" she asked, stepping outside. "Come here for a sec. Look at the house across the street." Amy squinted, following my gaze. "What am I looking at?" "There. Second floor. Do you see it?" She tilted her head. "I don't wait." "Oh, that's creepy." She stepped closer to me. "Do you think they're just watching us?" I laughed nervously. "Maybe. It's probably nothing." Amy frowned. "It's weird, though. We've never seen anyone over there before, right? You think we should go introduce ourselves?" "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, flipping the burgers again. "They're probably just shy or something." But as the days passed, it became harder to brush off the feeling that we were being watched. A couple of weeks later, we were raking leaves in the front yard when Amy suddenly grabbed my arm. "There's someone in the window again," she whispered. I followed her gaze. This time, there were two faces, a man and a woman, staring out of the same second-story window. Their expressions were blank, their faces pale and unblinking. "Why don't they move?" Amy muttered, shivering despite the warm afternoon sun. "Maybe they're just curious," I said, though the unease in my stomach told me otherwise. "Come on, let's finish up." But Amy wasn't satisfied. "I think we should say something. If they're going to keep staring at us, they should at least introduce themselves." That evening, Amy convinced me to go knock on their door. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. The house looked even more foreboding up close. The paint was peeling, and the mailbox was stuffed with unopened letters. I knocked twice and waited. After a long pause, the door opened a crack. A man in his 20s peered out. His hair was messy, and his clothes were wrinkled, like he'd just rolled out of bed. "Yeah?" he said flatly, his eyes barely meeting mine. "Hi, I'm Josh," I said, forcing a smile. "This is my wife, Amy. We live across the street and just wanted to say hello." The man blinked. "Okay." Amy cleared her throat. "We thought we saw someone in your window earlier." "A man and a woman?" The man's frown deepened. "No one's here but me." "Are you sure?" Amy pressed. "We've seen people in the window a few times now." "Just me," he interrupted, his tone sharper now. "That's it." Before we could say anything else, he closed the door. Amy and I exchanged a look as we walked back to our house. "That was weird," she said. "Yeah," I muttered. "Let's just leave them alone." For a few weeks, everything seemed to return to normal. No faces in the window, no strange encounters. Amy and I chalked it up to paranoia and went about our lives. But then, late one night, something happened that neither of us could explain. I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was faint at first, like the rhythmic knock of a tree branch against a window. I rolled over and glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. The tapping continued, soft but deliberate. "Amy," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Do you hear that?" She stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what?" "Listen." The tapping grew louder, echoing through the quiet house. It was coming from the living room. Amy sat up, her face pale. "What is that?" "I'll check it out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside drawer and crept toward the living room. The tapping grew louder as I approached. When I reached the window, I took a deep breath and yanked the blinds open. No one was there. But on the sidewalk outside, I saw him, the man from across the street. He was standing perfectly still, staring at the house. His face was pale, his expression blank, and in his hand, he held an old Polaroid camera. "Hey!" I shouted, banging on the window. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. One of the officers called me over to the edge of the yard. "You might want to see this," he said, holding up a Polaroid photo. It was lying in the grass. The picture showed Amy and me sitting in our living room. It had been taken from outside the window. After that night, Amy and I installed cameras around the house and kept the blinds shut tight. We never saw the man again, but the sense of unease lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, sent my heart racing. One evening, about a month later, I was reviewing footage from the security cameras when I noticed something. At around 2 a.m., the camera facing the front yard glitched, the screen flickering with static. When the feed returned, a figure was standing at the edge of the yard, tall, pale, and holding a camera. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I ever truly felt safe in that house again. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the tapping sound, faint and distant, as though it's waiting for me to notice it again. And I wonder if the man is still watching. In 2019, my husband, Ryan, and I rented the bottom unit of a duplex in a quiet little neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The building was old but charming, with creaky floors and tall windows that let in plenty of light. We were both working long hours, so we wanted a place where we could just relax and not have to worry about much. The upstairs unit was vacant when we moved in, and for the first few months, we had the whole building to ourselves. It was perfect. That changed in the spring, when the upstairs unit was rented out. We met the new tenant, a man named Dale, shortly after he moved in. He seemed friendly enough, a bit awkward, but polite. He was in his late 30s, dressed neatly, and didn't say much beyond the usual pleasantries. Ryan joked that Dale seemed like the kind of guy who would alphabetize his sock drawer. At first, we barely noticed him. He left for work early in the morning and came home late at night. We rarely crossed paths, and for a while, we almost forgot we even had a neighbor. But over time, things started to feel off. It began with small noises, footsteps above our bedroom at odd hours, the sound of furniture scraping across the floor late at night. At first, we shrugged it off. It was an old house, after all. But then the noises grew louder and more deliberate, like someone was stomping back and forth or dropping heavy objects on the floor. One night, as we were lying in bed, we heard a loud thud directly above us. Ryan sat up, frowning. What the hell is he doing up there? Maybe he dropped something? I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The thuds continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone pounding their fists against the floor. "All right, this is ridiculous," Ryan said, throwing back the covers. "I'm going up there." "Ryan, don't," I said, grabbing his arm. "It's late. Just let it go." But he was already out of bed, pulling on a sweatshirt. If he's going to act like this, he needs to hear about it. I stayed in the bedroom as Ryan went upstairs. I heard him knock on Dale's door and call out, "Hey man, can you keep it down? It's midnight." There was no response. Ryan knocked again, harder this time. "Dale, come on. We're trying to sleep down here." Still nothing. Eventually, he came back downstairs, shaking his head. "No answer," he said, climbing back into bed. "I know he's up there, though. I could hear him moving around." "Maybe he didn't hear you," I said, though the explanation felt weak even as I said it. Ryan sighed. "If it happens again tomorrow, I'm talking to the landlord." The next day, we didn't see Dale leave for work. His car was still in the driveway when we got home that evening, but there was no sign of him. That night, as we sat in the living room watching TV, we heard it again. The steady thud of footsteps above us, pacing back and forth. "All right, that's it," Ryan said, grabbing his phone. He called our landlord and explained what was happening, but the landlord didn't seem too concerned. "I'll talk to him tomorrow," he said. "Probably just unpacking or rearranging furniture. Give it a day or two." That night, I couldn't sleep. The footsteps continued until almost 3 a.m., and at one point, I swore I heard whispering, soft, unintelligible, but coming from directly above our bed. Things escalated the following weekend. Ryan was working a late shift, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book. It was just past midnight when I heard it. The sound of someone knocking on the wall. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but it grew louder and more insistent. "Dale?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" The knocking stopped. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence, before deciding to ignore it. But then, a new sound began. A low, scraping noise, like metal dragging across wood. It came from the same spot on the wall, just above where I was sitting. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and texted Ryan. "Dale's making weird noises again. It's creeping me out. Ryan, don't worry. I'll handle it when I get home. Just stay put." A few minutes later, the knocking started again, louder this time. It echoed through the house, each knock coming from a different spot. First above the couch, then above the kitchen, then back to the bedroom. It didn't sound random. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and went outside, planning to call Ryan and wait in the car until he got home. But as I stepped onto the porch, I froze. The lights in Dale's apartment were off, and the blinds were drawn. His car was still in the driveway, but the entire unit looked dark and empty. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the knocking had stopped. The next day, Ryan and I went upstairs to confront Dale once and for all. I stayed a step behind him as he knocked on the door, calling out, "Dale, we need to talk." No answer. Ryan knocked again, harder this time. When there was still no response, he tried the doorknob. It was locked. "Do you think he's in there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shook his head. "I don't know. Let's call the landlord." The landlord arrived an hour later with a spare key. He knocked once before unlocking the door and pushing it open. The smell hit us immediately. Stale air, mixed with something faintly metallic. The apartment was a mess. Furniture was overturned, dishes piled high in the sink, and the walls were covered in scratches. Long, deep grooves like something sharp had been dragged across them. There was no sign of Dale. The landlord called the police, who searched the apartment and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. According to them, Dale had moved out without notifying anyone, leaving the apartment abandoned. The noises stopped after that, but every so often, late at night, I think I hear faint whispers coming from the ceiling, and I wonder if Dale ever really left, or if something else had been living there all along. When I moved into my first house in the summer of 2020, I felt like I'd finally made it. After years of renting cramped apartments, I had a place to call my own. It wasn't anything fancy, a small, single-story home in an older neighborhood, but it was mine, and I loved it. The house next door, however, was less charming. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling and windows dark. The lawn was overgrown, the mailbox rusted and tilted. The neighborhood kids whispered about it being haunted, but I didn't think much of it. It was just another old house, forgotten and left to decay. That was until the lights came on. It happened one night in mid-July. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when I noticed a faint glow in one of the windows next door. At first, I thought it was just the streetlights reflecting off the glass, but as I watched, the light flickered, like a candle or an old lamp. I squinted, trying to make out any movement inside, but the curtains were drawn. "Looks like someone moved in," I muttered to myself. It seemed odd that I hadn't seen a moving truck or any signs of activity, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they'd moved in during the day while I was at work. The next morning, I decided to be neighborly. I walked over, a plate of cookies in hand, and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the quiet, and for a long moment, there was no response. I was about to turn away when I heard it, a faint rustling from inside. I knocked again. "Hello? I'm your neighbor. Just wanted to say hi." The rustling stopped. The house was silent again. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish, before heading back home. Maybe they weren't ready for visitors. Over the next few weeks, I kept an eye on the house. The lights came on sporadically, sometimes in the evening, sometimes late at night. I never saw anyone come or go, and the lawn remained overgrown. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass by one of the windows, but when I looked again, it was gone. One evening, as I was watering the flowers in my front yard, I noticed something odd. The upstairs window, which had always been closed, was open. The curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, and for a split second, I thought I saw a face peering down at me. "Okay, this is getting weird," I muttered. I tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Things escalated about a month after I first noticed the lights. It was a Saturday night, and I was binge-watching a series in the living room when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping sound, but it grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the back of the house. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the kitchen, my heart pounding. The back door was locked, but as I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door handle was moving. Someone was trying to get in. "Hey!" I shouted, banging on the door. The handle stopped moving, and I heard hurried footsteps retreating into the night. I flung the door open and shined the flashlight into the backyard, but there was no one there. The next day, I called the police and told them what had happened. They came by and checked the property but didn't find anything. I mentioned the house next door, how the lights had been coming on and off, and how I'd seen someone in the window. The officer, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, nodded slowly. "That house has been empty for years," he said. "Owner passed away, and the family hasn't done anything with it. Probably just kids messing around." "Kids don't try to break into back doors," I replied. He shrugged. "We'll keep an eye on the area." That night, I stayed up late, watching the house next door. Around 1 a.m., the light in the upstairs window flickered on. My stomach tightened as I stared at the glow, half expecting to see someone step into view. And then I did. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the curtains. It was tall and thin, its movements slow and jerky. It turned toward the window, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze lock onto me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then, without warning, the light went out. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I called the city and asked about the house, hoping to get in touch with the owner. They told me what the officer had already said. The house was vacant, tied up in legal limbo. No one was supposed to be living there. That evening, as I returned home from work, I noticed something on my porch, a single photograph. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The picture was grainy and slightly blurred, but it clearly showed my house. More specifically, it showed me sitting on the porch the previous night. The photo had been taken from the upstairs window of the house next door. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the house, set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the soft scraping sound, this time at the front door. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was standing on my porch. It was the same tall, thin shape I'd seen in the window, its features obscured by the shadows. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Then, slowly, it turned and walked back toward the house next door. The next day, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that house, not with whatever was living next door. A week later, I broke my lease and moved out. I didn't care about the penalties. I just wanted to feel safe again. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that house. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the figure in the window and the photo on my porch. And I wonder if it's watching someone else now, waiting for its next neighbor.